Is everyone back now, is it?
It doesn't look like they are yet. We've just got 7 participants.
No problem at all. So for those that are back, thanks so much. And have a think about feeding back some sort of definitions or ideas that you came up with, and then we can do a bit of sharing.
There we go, it's all sorted now.
Okie dokie, brilliant. So welcome back everyone now. I was just mentioning to the other participants that came a little bit, a few seconds earlier than you, just time to have a bit of a share now. So what did we come up with? What do we think a definition of good mental health particularly is? Who's willing to sort of unmute themselves and perhaps share what they and their group discussed during that brief interlude? Anyone going to take the plunge? No one's going to take the plunge? Was it a breakout room of silence?
No, we're just trying to unmute ourselves because we came back as muted.
Oh, great.
And being comfortable and not necessarily happy. Good mental health doesn't necessarily mean happiness, but being comfortable in yourself.
Super. I like that point about you don't necessarily have to be happy. So in terms of, you don't have to be the life and soul of the party, ray of sunshine and whatnot. Any other points anyone else came up with that would be included in that definition of good mental health?
We talked about resilience in our group and ability to cope with pressures.
Brilliant. Yeah, absolutely. That resilience. So bounce back and for some bounce up as opposed to just bouncing back to your current state. Anything else from any of the other groups?
I think we said, sorry, go Debbie. Sorry, I was saying is that we were saying that sort of an even state of well-being, not influenced by surroundings, things that are going on around.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, that is good, definitely. Yeah, so a focus on yourself, as it were, as opposed to being drawn into feeling a certain way because of what's going on around you. Caitlin, did you have something that you wanted to talk as well?
I'm Jess. I don't know why it's come up with my colleague's name. Caitlin is my colleague. I'm not sure why it's come up with her name.
Okay.
Just to sort of not live in those polar extremes. Coming from parents that are not in a good place. My mum's days are always the worst days ever or the best days ever. And I think it's just sort of finding some kind of middle ground where you can have a good day and a bad day, but it's fairly normal.
Yeah, okay, absolutely, yeah, definitely. So having almost that control, as it were, to moderate and accept that, some things sometimes it's not always going to be perfect. Brilliant. Anybody else want to share anything before I share the WHO definition, as it were?
We just mentioned the ability to share feelings, to be able to express your feelings to somebody and talk to somebody. Yeah,
definitely, absolutely. That openness, definitely, and that communication. And communication is going to play a huge part in this workshop and the focus of it. It's not teaching you to suck eggs. I'm sure that's something that you're all aware of, but sometimes in the busy life that we have, and certainly working life, and at the moment when we're thinking about the pandemic in this context, it's really, really easy to stop communicating, to internalize your own emotions, but also to stop asking other people as well what's going on in the work context, and go that extra mile. So if we think about a definition that the WHO have come up with in the situation of this, I think the particular focus from the quotation on the screen is in the sense that it's individual and that it's talking about his or her own abilities. And that's an interesting point that was raised in the sense that it's a focus on yourself, an ability to cope, as it were, and that word comes up quite a lot. How are you coping? How are you doing? And with the normal stresses of life, and that you can work productively and fruitfully, which is an interesting choice of words, to be able to make a contribution to your community. So it's like being inclusive, being included, and also participating in working life, normal life, as it were, and having the ability to do that. And I think that's really, really important. There's a lot of focus on mental ill health as opposed to mental health generally and mental good health. And that's something that we know we're now going to focus on mental ill health, because that's the purpose of the webinar really. But when we look at mental health and specifically ill health, the focus generally tends to be on the conditions that mental ill health are associated with, and some of them range from normal, which everyone has and would have throughout their lifetime, or to the more serious that are on the slide is there. But generally, the stigma attached to mental health is, if you were to say to somebody, or a colleague was to say, or someone was to confide in you and say, you know, I've got poor mental health, I'm struggling with my mental health, what has become apparent is there's an assumption that they have one of the more serious conditions, and therefore it's fear of the line manager. How do I deal with that? It all of a sudden becomes a major problem when we're thinking about handling it in terms of sickness absence, employment law, HR, interaction with other colleagues. How do we manage that person? How do we talk to them? And we very much tend to dramatise the situation that we're experiencing. And it's important to note really that mental ill health is not always a serious situation. It's part of life. It's part of normality, and it's something that should be accepted, and it's something that we should be aware of as line managers and colleagues throughout our day-to-day activity, not something that we should be frightened of either. So Daniel's now going to take us into looking at mental health in relation to the work context.
Okay, thanks, Jenny. So obviously we've spoken a bit this morning already about what our understanding of mental health is, or good mental health is, and mental ill health. In a workplace context, obviously this is really important. Up on the screen there's an infographic which was part of a study by Stevenson and Farmer from a few years ago, but we include it because it's a useful way of visualizing the relationship between somebody's mental health and in putting that in a workplace context. So they conducted a study and they categorized people into three different subsets, three different groups, which you can see displayed on the slide. There we go. Getting ahead of myself there. So obviously the main category of people is people who are thriving at work. And when someone's thriving at work, you know, maybe they are quite happy, they're quite sociable, they can take on more tasks, they feel okay. You know when you're thriving in work because you think, oh, do you know what, I've had a good day at work there. You know, I had my to-do list, I had my task list, I had whatever I had to do and I got it done, and I feel quite happy where I am. Obviously, the other categories are struggling in work, and it's important to remember, I think the key takeaway from our workshop today is that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to this. So when someone could be thriving in work at the start of the week, they could quite easily find themselves struggling in work by the end of the week on a Friday afternoon. Work itself is quite, it's obviously a big part of our lives, and certainly I think we can all agree on this call that work itself has changed dramatically in the past 7 or 8 months, and we can just see in that an example of how much work can change and how much of an effect it can have on people's mental health. So the third category there is the smallest, so it's people who are ill and possibly off work, which is obviously not good for anyone really, either the employee or the employer, because obviously you're talking about lost productivity, you're talking about a deterioration in the relationship potentially between the company and the employee, which obviously is no good for anyone. But the important thing to remember, as we were talking about before, is that mental health, it's one of those things that can inspire a lot of fear because it's so unknown and so unpredictable, but that is only because it affects everyone in completely different ways. So when we talk about mental health, it's helpful, I think, to think of it as a continuum on which, you know, someone might be on one end one day and on the other end, you know, on another day. It's really sounds a bit nebulous, but it's important to remember that there are things and methods of working and ways we can approach the problem or the issues that we encounter with mental health in order to sort of make sure that we're dealing with it appropriately and that we're not mishandling it, shall we say. And it's also important to note that because the world of work is different and changes so dramatically all the time, although there is that aspect of it, there is also the fact that mental health itself can be boosted by coming to work. And I know that might sound a bit strange, but certainly myself and my colleagues, we've missed coming into the office, certainly, and seeing each other. Work can represent a bit of a social outlet for people. And I'm not saying it's like an escape from their home lives, that's the wrong word to use, but certainly it represents, if you've got something going on at home, sometimes I've felt really good in sort of coming into work and thinking, oh, do you know what, I'm just going to leave that at the door, get my teeth stuck into whatever I've got to do that day. And you enter a state of flow and you kind of just not forget about your problems at home, but it helps you to deal with them. It helps you to tackle them. So I suppose the important thing to remember is that we all have mental health. It operates on a continuum. And the Stevenson Pharma Review infographic that's up there on the screen, during their study, they said that, someone who has poor mental health can still thrive in work. And obviously that might shock some people. They may think, well, someone with a poor mental health problem might be obviously ill or possibly off work. But with the right treatment, the right support and the right situations put into place, someone with a mental health issue can still thrive in work and still sort of do well in work as long as the support is there. So we're going to put you into another breakout room now. And in your groups, I'd like you to discuss what you think are some of the outward signs of good mental health. We talked about what good mental health feels like or looks like, in the previous breakout room. In this one, I want to talk about the outward signs of what good mental health will look like, okay? And also what are some of the signs of poor mental health that we could probably see in our colleagues or in ourselves. So when we go into the breakout room, if you feel up to it, please nominate some sort of spokesperson who can, when we come back, we'll be able to discuss what the group has talked about. And we'll obviously share our findings when we come back. So Izzy, could you please do the honors and send everyone into the breakout rooms, and I think we'll be put into the breakout rooms for about 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and feedback for around about 3 or 4 minutes. Okay.
Here we go. Yeah.
Hello.
Hello.
Can we bring the presentation back up, please? Because I don't have it. Sorry. Here we go. Okay, Izzy, have we got everybody back from their virtual breakout rooms?
I'm just waiting on a couple. I think it gives everyone 60 seconds to leave.
A lot to talk about, to be fair. So
yeah, we've got 7 at the moment.
Okay.
There we go.
Everybody back?
Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, everybody, thank you for breaking out. Oh, that's the next slide. Again, I'm getting ahead of myself. There we go. So who would like to go first with talking about signs of good mental health in the workplace? Anybody?
I don't mind going first.
Please continue. Go on.
a lot of these are opposites. So obviously signs of good mental health is little or no absenteeism. Sign of poor mental health could be a high absenteeism or a short notice absenteeism. So they appear to be okay one day, but then the day after, obviously there's no obvious signs of illness. I've got being motivated, a sign of good mental health, of appearing motivated in the work or tasks that they need to complete. Whereas obviously somebody that lacks motivation could be a sign. A positive attitude, good sign of good mental health, and undertakes everything positively. Whereas again, a negative attitude to the tasks that they need to undertake could be a sign of poor mental health. Open communication, so that the open and freely talking, open discussions, meetings with colleagues, good mental health. Whereas poor mental health could be somebody that's a little bit poor communicatively, doesn't share feelings, isn't open in maybe a meeting environment or even with colleagues, could become a little introverted. And then we just talked about for poor mental health, extremes in personality. So not necessarily somebody that's sad, it could be somebody that's deliriously happy, but it also could be a sign that it's an extreme really of a personality, and sometimes maybe an irrational opinion on certain things, not having the ability to look at things rationally.
Irrationality, some sort of sense of maybe tipping into a paranoia almost sometimes, maybe.
Yes, absolutely.
I thought it was interesting what you said, Andrea, about no absenteeism. Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. So thanks very much for that. So thanks, Andrea. And someone from another group, you'd like to share your findings of good mental health versus poor mental health? If you want to frame it in the same way that Andrea's done it and sort of put it in opposites, that's fine.
Yeah, so I'll happily kind of go in terms of our group. So I think in terms of good mental health, you know, they're calm, they're in a steady state all the time, they don't change how they deal with things. Conversely, if that type of person starts to act out of the ordinary, then that is probably a sign that something is perhaps not well with them. The outward sign in terms of looking and looking well, you know, do they look fit? Do they look healthy? But somebody, you know, similarly that perhaps you usually think looks fit and well, then perhaps if they don't, then that could be a sign that there is something not quite right. There's the productivity aspect in terms of the work. So consistently, they've always been a good performer, but you notice signs in terms of drop off in terms of performance. Another good indicator that there might be something wrong. I think the thing that probably covers both is anything that is out of the norm with that particular person, and you probably only get to know that when you've known a person for a prolonged period of time. You know what their normal state is. So if you start to see anything out with that normal state, then that's probably a sign that there is potentially something not right. And probably worth investigating.
Brilliant. Investigating, I like it. Okay. And is there anybody else who's got anything they want to? I don't know how many breakout rooms there were, so
maybe participate now that whilst my partner doesn't go on the next call. I think with this, when you're talking about the signs of good and ill mental health, I think it can be too easy sometimes to fall into those stereotypes of saying, oh, if someone looks happy and they're, you know, working really well and they're not being off work, then they must be well. But actually, and this is what our group was discussing as well, is it's the differences in behaviour. Sometimes people might be normally shy and not really engage in meetings, and they might be perfectly happy and mentally well. And actually for them, mental ill health might look like all of a sudden becoming really engaged in meetings, really outspoken. It might be over productivity as well. So it's not always the usual signs. I think the key for me, the way that I think about it, is focusing on changes of behaviour. What is that colleague is demonstrating that is different from their normal? And it's important, I think, for us to remind ourselves that it's not always the obvious. It's not like, oh, they haven't showered or they're not wearing makeup or that sort of stuff. It's actually, it can be much more subtle than that. And And I just think that it's really important for people to kind of keep that in the back of their minds. Thank you.
Thanks, Carolina. That's great. So I think the main sort of theme or element that's come out of your discussions is, as Caroline has just correctly pointed out, is a change in behavior. And obviously we can only really notice changes in behavior when we know the person, you know, and that's why it's so important to develop good relationships in the workplace, because you will know when, you know, a colleague who sat next to you for 10, 15 years is having a bad time because they won't be themselves. You know, it'll be completely opposite type of behavior, and that behavior could be triggered by something outside of work, you know. And if you know them well, you'll obviously be able to speak to that and say, oh, by the way, I know so and so, you know, their pets just died or something like that. Whereas maybe it could be triggered by something in work itself. And obviously both are important, but it's important to recognize the distinction between problems that arise outside work that have an impact on the person in work, and obviously problems that arise because of the work itself. I think it's important to obviously to notice that. So thanks very much everyone for your contributions there. I really appreciate that. We're now going to talk about, let's see if I can get the next slide up. There we go. Pressure. So interestingly, we talked about in the previous breakout rooms how pressure can affect people and it can affect performance. And on the graph there, you can see that the level of pressure exerted can obviously have an impact on performance. And they've done studies to show that our brains can deal, you know, with a certain amount of pressure. You know, a certain amount of pressure is quite good. And you'll know this yourself when you're trying to get something done. If you set yourself a fairly reasonable deadline, you'll think, right, okay, I've got to smash this. And if I can get it done by X points, you know, I'll be sound, I'll be golden. As you can see on the graph there, we've all got quite a large comfort zone. And, you know, comfort zones, we all know what it feels like to be in our comfort zone, because it feels, you guessed it, it feels comfortable. You know, you'll be able to do X, Y, and Z. You'll be, you know, able to smash your targets. You'll be fine. You know, you're not being particularly stretched by work. And it's important to recognize that, you know, if we're in our comfort zones for too long, you know, or the level of pressure is virtually nothing, our performance, our productivity kind of drops, and we kind of tip into the blue end of the scale, and we end up being bored. And no one likes being bored in work. You know, it just makes the days go on longer, and you just don't feel mentally stimulated at all. So it's important to sort of to recognize when you are slipping into boredom, or when people are slipping into boredom around you, because obviously maybe they're not getting the right type of work, or that, you know, they're not being challenged enough sufficiently by work. In the next category up is stretch. So there's a bit of a sweet spot in the middle, where obviously you'll see the performance peaks in between stretch and strain. And it's obviously quite difficult to recognize when someone's being stretched and when someone's in strain. You know, it's a fine sort of line, but people's performance when they're in that sort of, I call it the sweet spot in between stretch and strain, their performance is going to be fairly high. But as a sort of an opposite to that, staying in that zone for a sustained amount of time can trigger sort of, you know, you falling onto the lower end and your productivity actually drops off. And, you know, certainly just to take a personal example, you know, I was, I'd completed my work for the day last week. I can't remember what day it was. I came downstairs, my partner was beavering away and he was working till about 8 o'clock. And I said, you know, are you actually getting much done on this? I think it was some sort of presentation. And he said, no, do you know what? I'm just staring at the screen a lot of the time. I said, right, you need to take a break. You need to put the laptop down, come back to it with a fresh set of eyes, because you've obviously tipped into, you know, a territory where you're just not, your cognitive ability to function just isn't going to be as good as it is if you got some rest and just came back to it with a fresh set of eyes. So it's really important as well to recognize that when someone's in a territory where they're constantly under strain and constantly put under pressure, their productivity is just going to plummet and it's going to go down, and they're potentially going to be in crisis mode, which would mean potentially maybe even a detrimental effect on their mental or their physical well-being. You know, nobody wants that. So it's important to recognize that, you know, we've all got an element of a comfort zone that we can operate in, you know, and that's fine to be in for a while. However, we can still operate to a certain degree of productivity when we're in between stretch and strain. So we've got quite a lot on and we're feeling challenged, but we're actually hitting the targets and we're doing what we need to do, okay? I'm now going to hand over to Jenny, who is going to talk a bit more about workplace pressure in more detail.
So we couldn't get away from health and safety when we're thinking about stress and pressure and the effects that it has on employees. And pre-COVID, the health and safety executive actually had stress management on their radar. Now, obviously, COVID came along and scuppered their plans, and therefore they had a new set of priorities. However, when the health and safety executive think about pressure and its ability to create stress on a workforce, they consider it under the 6 headings that you can see it essentially on the screen. And it's all stuff that we know is important and sounds pretty basic, but yet we never do all 6 steps together. There's always an element of 1 or 2 or maybe even 4, but we never actually do it all combined, and we never tie it all together. Now, Dan alluded to the fact that later on in the presentation, we're going to be talking about how to bring this all together, and we will teach you how to do that, and you'll have a little bit of a takeaway to do that. But if we just look at what's on the screen now, essentially, when we're thinking about excess pressure and what contributes to stress, the 6 areas are identified in its basic form, thinking about workload and pattern and work environment. Now, in the context of coronavirus, work environment and pattern, for example, are really quite prevalent in the sense that majority of people are working from home, or perhaps it's a hybrid model, and therefore that in itself can cause pressure and stress. And how does that work out logistically, for one? What's the environment that they're working like at home, and are they on the kitchen table, for example? Are their kids at home self-isolating because their class has been sent home with a positive case of coronavirus, and therefore is it difficult to obviously maintain that reduction of pressure and stress because of that? So we need to pay consideration to those elements. Autonomy is really, really important, and we're considering how to reduce pressure and stress of individuals. How much say do people have in the way that they work, whether that's the balance of what they're doing, how they actually deliver that work, the hours that they work, and do we offer flexible working? How are we actually assigning them work, and how are they accepting it? Where are they delivering that work? All sorts of different things when we think about giving them autonomy. And obviously, for those that are familiar with productivity and employee engagement practices, you'll know that autonomy and employee voice is massive when it comes to achieving high levels of employee engagement. The same goes for when we're thinking about reducing pressure and stress in the workplace. Autonomy can help that. And 9 times out of 10, the feeling of stress or pressure can be alleviated by somebody having a goal to work towards, or feeling that they're in control of their own destiny, of their own workload, as it were. Thinking about support, again, a constant message that's running through this session. When we're thinking about encouragement, line manager and colleague support, we're thinking about one-to-ones, we're thinking about team building, we're looking at mentoring and coaching individuals, knowing that we have supportive sessions, not only in a formal supervision type framework, but also if it's just a bit of a breakout session to do some team building activities, just to chat about how your day's gone. We all know that the coffee chats have stopped. In terms of, you no longer buy the photocopier, you're not getting a brew anymore in the kitchen. So we need to still encourage that supportive behaviour that we have in the workplace. Relationships. Now, this is really important, especially for myself being a HR consultant. Quite often I do see line managers who want to avoid conflict by not addressing it. Now, that obviously has the opposite effect in some situations, because, for example, if an individual or a circumstance is causing an employee pressure or stress, then by you as a manager not addressing the cause of that can often lead to problems in itself. So, for example, if you're not dealing with a grievance in a timely fashion, if you're not addressing a conduct issue, either by an informal or formal route on the disciplinary process, then that in itself can cause an individual pressure. So make sure that you are consistently adopting your process and policy. Understanding an individual's role And that is important when we're thinking about understanding the individual itself, something that has been brought up throughout the feedback sessions. When we think about what is it that person does, what do we know about them, their ability to do it, their need to do it, their motivation to do it. Is it a good fit for them? And we'll only know that by getting to know the individual that we work with. And change, I don't care what anyone says, no one likes change. They may like it more than others, but they don't actually like change. And that can be small amounts of change. If it's a change of my manager, if it's a change of using the photocopier, a change of pen, or it could be large scale when we're thinking about a change to the organisation in terms of redundancy or recruitment or heads of departments and whatnot. How we communicate and manage that change is important, and there needs to be a strategy around that, and there needs to be a process, and communication is at the heart of everything that we do, so that it doesn't breed insecurity with the individual, which could lead to stress and obviously pressure, and therefore impact their mental health. So when we're thinking about health and safety, we're also thinking about managing and controlling the risk factors. And we can do that in a business as line managers. So you're now going to pop into another breakout room to think about what is it as employers you can do to manage and control the risk factors when it comes to preventing poor mental health, preventing stress, and preventing pressure. What is it that we can do as a business? So Izzy, if you could do your magic again, we're just going to go for 4 minutes this time, if that's all right. And then we'll feed back again. Thank you so much.
No worries. There you go. Hello.
Yo.
Just us.
Yeah, no one's coming back.
They've all gone.
They obviously needed a lot of time.
This is a good sign, though. It tells you that they're, discussing things properly.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, it says they'll close in 2 seconds anyway. So yeah, everyone's back now.
Welcome back. So obviously it threw you all out. So I'm guessing that you had a good discussion then about what we should be doing, and obviously identifying what those risks were, but obviously how to manage and control them. Does anyone want to share what their group discussed, and then we can get some feedback from what you thought of?
Yeah, I can go for my
Super.
group. Looking at those 6 items, we agreed that across the board communication is key, and varying different ways of communication in terms of having one-to-ones, having team meetings, seeing people face to face, as it were, over video calls and things.
Yeah.
We also, all of us are part of companies that do anonymous feedback surveys.
Okay.
I think everyone else in the group had introduced that since COVID had happened, but that's actually something that we've done for a few years. And we have an employee net promoter score that covers anonymous feedback on how happy you are at work, what processes you'd like to improve, what you like about your job, what you don't.
Is there a specific focus on how you're feeling then in those surveys then? Great. Okay.
Yeah, you have to score your work happiness.
Okay.
And then it's scored, and then there's a free text box as well for a few of the questions. And then that all gets discussed by the support team. And we implement changes, and then we have a you said we did session, and we'll put out a newsletter that says you asked for this and we've implemented it, or you asked. We have start, stop, keeps is what we call it in the questionnaire. and then we stop things they don't want anymore, and we start doing things they do want, and we keep going with what they liked. So engagement was what we discussed, and I think that really covers that, and just make sure that people feel that they've been heard.
Yeah, absolutely, definitely some really key points. I think that what's important there is a range of communication types and styles and forums, really, because what, as Dan said earlier on, one size does not fit all. So to be able to be inclusive for all sorts of different people who like to communicate in different ways, then that's important. So that's great. Thanks for sharing that. I appreciate that. Anybody else want to share what their group was talking about? Please don't be shy. I don't want to have to force people and unmute you. Would that be good for your stress levels or pressure?
I'd kind of, I think we echoed a lot of what was just said there. But, one of the things that was also mentioned was making sure that the company had the right policies in place. Great. So one of the things that was kind of mentioned was zero tolerance in terms of bullying or harassment. Yes. Not in a specific sort of way, but just as an example of something that can create, stress within the workplace. And if owners, directors kind of turn a blind eye to that, then it does have the ability to kind of, just seep into the culture and become more of a wide-ranging issue. Yeah. Other things that we kind of talked about. I mean, one of the contributors talked about having weekly PT sessions. It kind of links in with kind of the communication piece, having more of an open environment. Yeah. I think that was a key one. I think COVID, the learnings that have come out of COVID, in terms of things like flexible working and being a business that's prepared to do things differently to encourage more staff engagement. They're probably having positives that have come out of the last 6 months as well. So it's perhaps building on that, going into next year for a lot of companies.
Definitely, brilliant. Okay, great. So I thought of quite a few different risks, and therefore, if I sort of show them on the screen, these were the risk factors that I thought could impact an employee, and therefore, when we're thinking about controlling them, essentially, we need to avoid these risks. So when we're thinking about working hours, lone working as well. And lone working historically is always just you in a building on your own. But what about when you're at home on your own? Then it's, you're in the comfort of your own home, and yes, you've got loose women on in the background maybe, so you're not technically alone, as it were, and you can go and get yourself a brew whenever you want. And you can even wear your joggers and a dress like I'm doing today. But you are still alone, and therefore being alone at work it's difficult, whether you're at home or whether you are in the office. Also being alone in your thoughts as well. So it's not the physical presence of you just being on your own, but also feeling like you've got no one to turn to, feeling like you can't actually open up. So that was something that was talked about earlier on, in that you've got the ability to share how you're feeling, and you feel confident and comfortable to be able to do that is important. Lack of job security being one, and obviously you can see some others on the list as well. And what you were just mentioning there, the gentleman was mentioning there in relation to ineffective action in relation to disruptive behaviour as well. But also as well, when we think about bullying and harassment, also a negative opinion when it comes to mental health. Those individuals that poo-poo it or say things like man up, or things like that. We also need to break down the barriers to know that everyone has mental health. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's poor, but throughout your lifetime, you're going to have ranges of what those emotions look like, and just more of an acceptance needs to be generated in the workplace to be able to understand that it's okay to not be okay, to coin that phrase that's used quite a lot. So why do we bother thinking about mental health? If everyone's got it, and we all know that it's going to be up and down, and it's going to be influenced by other situations outside of our control, or sometimes within our control, why do we even bother as a business to actually even think about it? Well, there's three main elements really to it, in the sense that there's the individual, the human costs, as it were. When we talk about costs, we're not thinking that necessarily just about financial cost and financial impact to the business, but we're thinking about the cost of that individual itself and their feelings and their emotions, but also the impact that that has to them as an individual, potentially financially, and that if you don't offer company sick pay or you just offer the statutory sick pay, that they're going to be a financial loss. But also as well, how's that going to impact them at home? How's that going to impact their family? There's a wider implication as well. So therefore, that's one of the reasons why we would look to support mental health, to support them as an individual and just do the right thing. And also when we're thinking about the cost to you, then obviously there's the visible costs, which clearly are always the financial costs, the impacts when we're thinking about loss of productivity, not meeting customer deadlines, for example, providing poor customer service, potentially damaging reputation and whatnot, if an individual isn't on their A game, as it were. But then obviously the hidden costs as well, in the fact the impact to the rest of the workforce, in the sense that how is that individual's mental health being treated, obviously, and what's that sending around the rest of the team, but also if the individual is off sick, and how's that affecting the workforce, the remaining team's workforce, and therefore their stress and pressure and mental health levels, as it were. But then obviously we think about that something that we don't often tackle, government, society and the economy, so the impact on to the NHS, for example, looking at all those wider resources, thinking about the economy generally and how that works. There's a common stigma attached that obviously if you are suffering from poor mental health, that you're a recluse and you take yourself away and that's it, and that you're not contributing to society, as it were. And in some cases maybe you are, in some cases maybe you aren't. But obviously there is these wider implications when we're thinking about the impact to society as well, and are you participating? You remember in the WHO definition, it talks about your ability to contribute to the community. Well, this is that cost there when thinking about cost to society. If you're not of good mental health at that particular point in time, what is your contribution to the community, as it were? So 1 in 4 people, it would suggest, will experience a mental health issue in any one given year. And that's important and quite a startling stat, as it were. But that makes it more real in the sense that it's fine, it's absolutely fine. And that doesn't necessarily mean that someone's going to get bipolar, or it doesn't mean that someone's going to turn into schizophrenic, as it were, but that potentially it's going to be stress, or potentially it might be anxiety. So this is a common thing that we're dealing with. And therefore, it's why it's important that we address this from an employment law and HR point of view, because it's becoming more prevalent. 70 million working days have been lost every year because of mental ill health. And that's a stat that was provided by the Chief Medical Officer. When you get stats all the time, you get them from CIPD, or you can get them from the Office of National Statistics. Generally, the most common reasons are back pain, stress and anxiety, or just common illnesses, minor illnesses, coughs, colds, that type of thing. And that's generally the top 3. So stress is up there, as is obviously mental health. And 49% of respondents to a particular survey that was conducted by the Time to Change organisation would feel uncomfortable talking to their employer about mental health. 49% do not want to speak to their employer and tell them. And that's a really sad statistic in my mind. I think if we were to improve that statistic and we were to get more people feeling more comfortable about this and reduce the taboo and increase the awareness around it, then the rest of the figures would hopefully go down as well. So again, just hammering it home why it's important. And you've already made this a first step, you're already here. So I feel like I'm preaching to the converted, as it were. But it's important that we continue this post this session, and that it's important to do the right thing and focus on the people and that human element. Definitely, we have a duty of care to our employees, not just from a legal sense, from the health and safety point of view, to provide that environment and that safe working place for them, but also as individuals, human to human, to ensure that there's a direct link between mental and physical health as well, to look after them. But when we're thinking about our legal obligations and the risk around that, we're also addressing the health and safety implications, but also discrimination, where ill health can turn into a disability potentially. Dan, our legal eagle, is going to turn onto that very shortly. And we're thinking then about productivity and costs. We've already talked about this a lot in terms of reducing absence, wherefore we could improve performance when they are in the business, but ultimately, could we help improve productivity as well. Looking at reducing training and retraining costs. For example, if an individual has been out of the business for a long time, it could be that they've forgotten something or they feel a bit rusty, lacking in confidence. We're potentially going to have to retrain them. So again, it's a loss of productivity again. And obviously reducing presenteeism. There was an interesting point that was made earlier on in one of the breakout sessions when you came back that talked about potentially a sign of good mental health was no absenteeism. Could that be because the individual is hiding their illness? They don't want to be seen to have something wrong with them in their mind, and therefore could it be that presenteeism is something that they use to actually tackle that? Putting their face on every day, not necessarily with makeup, but just obviously showing that they're turning up, they're absolutely fine, but really inside they're struggling. So just because somebody's in work doesn't necessarily mean that they are okay. And then obviously the wider picture that we have in relation to our employee reputation, in that when we think about employing millennials, they're less focused now on financial reward, although trust me, there's still quite a few out there that are very focused on financial reward. And they want more intrinsic and extrinsic benefits, that whole plethora of offering. And therefore they'll want to know what you're doing in relation to corporate social responsibility. What charities are you supporting? How are you supporting wellbeing generally? How are you supporting career progression? How are you supporting in times of need? All that sort of elements. And therefore it's really, really important, not only again to do the right thing, but also to enhance your employer branding. That's very, very important to the outside world as well. So essentially the Stevenson and Farmer review recommended that as a core, we look to do the following 6 steps, and we'll come back to this as well and use it when we're thinking about creating a wellbeing strategy and where you actually go from here. So essentially that first point is actually have a plan. What are you going to do to improve mental health in your workplace? And obviously potentially the first step of your plan was to come on some training and actually work out what it is you need to do. So you've already made that first step, but then it's how we then translate that into some actual usable information, something that we can take away. Develop awareness, that's massive in the business, and thinking about where they can access information. So develop positive awareness and understanding of what mental health is generally as a topic, but also the signs of good and poor mental health. Encouraging that openness of conversation, definitely, and making sure that you have regular communication. So one-to-ones, for example, are a perfect forum to do this, where you don't just focus on work, but you actually have some open dialogue in relation to how the employees dealing with the current circumstances, but also generally what's going on in their life. It also facilitates just good engagement as well, and general productivity. It's that trust relationship that we need to build with our employees. Good working conditions to ensure a healthy work-life balance. How many of you working from home would say that you've actually taken regular breaks? Are you working longer now, potentially, because you're at home? Because you roll out of bed, have a shower, walk to the next room, and all of a sudden you are now at your desk. You're not actually commuting anymore. So where you've avoided the half an hour commute either side, are you working for an hour longer? Potentially. So we need to be thinking about that work-life balance and creating optimum working conditions. A bit like Dan's partner, he needs to stop working till 8 o'clock, and he needs to go in with a fresh pair of eyes. So thinking about people management, obviously regular conversations, again, that's sort of echoed really in point 3, as well as point 5, but monitoring. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're peering around bookcases and checking that everyone's okay, and that we are recording this stringently on a document, but that we are proactively asking pertinent questions. At first, it'll feel very strange. At first, it'll feel like you're being intrusive, but if you build it into the normal culture of your workplace, how are you doing? It feels like a less loaded question. And it's always really important to remember from my point of view when I'm thinking about having a conversation with an employee is, whilst the employee wants to hear what you're going through too, it's not about you, it's about them. You've asked the question, wait to hear their answer. If you, at that time you don't have time to hear the answer, please don't ask the question at that moment in time. wait until you have time to really hear, digest, and potentially support someone through something if they need some help when they come back to you with their answer. And the answer is, I'm not feeling so great. Make sure you don't have to rush off to another team's call. Okay. So on that note, Dan is going to, I'll just give him the remote control. He's going to now talk about the legal implications when we think about mental health, stress, pressure in the workplace.
Thanks very much, Jenny. I should just say before I begin this next section, my dog is kicking off. I don't know what it is, probably the postman. So perils of working at home. I apologize if you do hear a dog barking, then I sincerely apologize. But for this next section, I'm going to look at the legal risks associated with getting or dealing with a mental health issue in the workplace incorrectly or wrongly. I've put some of the issues we can face up there on the slide. I'll be completely honest, because of our time constraints, I'm going to concentrate the majority of what I speak about today to discrimination claims and the issues surrounding those. But I will speak briefly about grievances and the like as well. So a grievance, I mean, the gentleman before mentioned ineffective action. So say, for example, if someone brings up an issue, I always say to my clients that, it's obviously, to me, it's not really important how many grievances you get in an organization, although less is obviously going to be better than more. But the important thing is how you deal with those grievances, and in dealing with them either incorrectly by sort of not really investigating them properly, or not really looking into the issues that have been raised by them, or not changing anything and just kind of paying lip service to the entire idea and leaving it to fester, can really cause problems and potentially lead to the next point down on the slide there, which is constructive dismissal. All that is when the employer has done something so bad that it causes the employee to be able to say, right, you know what, you breached my contract, I'm off, I'm going to take you to an employment tribunal. So prime example, not dealing with a grievance correctly, series of incidents that kind of get worse and worse, and it only takes one minor or seemingly minor event to cause the employee to say, right, do you know what, I'm off, that's the last straw doctrine. So grievances, constructive dismissal, discrimination claims, I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail in a moment. And health and safety breaches, again, I'm not going to talk a great deal about this because we have a great health and safety team who, if you are interested in speaking to them, just get in touch after the session and we can point you in the direction of the head of that department, Chris Walker, who's brilliant, and he'll take you through some of the issues surrounding mental health and health and safety breaches and what we can do to tackle those. So getting straight into it, let's see if I can control the screen. Oh, there we go. So disability discrimination, obviously, this is what we need to be thinking about when we're talking about mental health issues. And when I say disability, I'm being very specific in what I mean by that, okay? So it's the legal definition of a disability. And it's important to remember, okay, whether you're dealing with it yourself or you're talking to managers about this, just because someone has a mental health issue, okay, whether that's stress at work, whether that's anxiety, whether that's depression, whatever it is, it does not immediately follow that that is a disability for the purposes of the Equality Act, Section 6.1, okay? So the important thing to remember if someone presents with that problem or that comes onto your desk is to ask yourself the following questions to be able to determine whether or not it would fit the bill of being a disability under the Equality Act. Because if it is, there are going to be certain legal obligations placed on you as the employer to deal with it appropriately. If it isn't, you may need to deal with it or tackle it in a different way, okay? So the first question to ask yourself is, do we have a physical or a mental impairment? Obviously, when we're talking about mental health issues, it's going to be a mental impairment, okay? So if there's a mental impairment that has an adverse effect, which is substantial, and so a substantial effect has got to be more than minor or trivial, okay? So if we've got something that is more than minor or trivial, we go to the next question to ask ourselves, which is, does that substantial effect, is it long term? So by long term, we mean, has it lasted or is it likely to last for at least 12 months, okay? And then we can ask ourselves the final question of if the long-term substantial effects must have an adverse effect on normal day-to-day activities, Okay, so I apologize if I'm teaching people to suck eggs there, but it's important, I think, to keep those questions in mind when we're talking about mental health issues that may potentially be a disability. Okay, so it's important to not make the immediate jump to the conclusion that it is a disability automatically, and that person can, you know, call the shots, if you like. I was talking to a client the other day who was quite shocked that a person had only been with them for, I think it was a number of weeks, and they were presented with anxiety issues. And I said, well, we need to probably delve into that a bit and see how long they've been suffering with that, what are the effects of it, you know, operating on the understanding that it could potentially be a disability. And the client was a bit taken aback by the fact that, well, this person's only just started working with us for 3 weeks. How can they already be able to have all these rights? And I had to point out to them, well, you know, that's the purpose of the Equality Act, unfortunately, and we've got to operate within the bounds of the law. So again, a disability, it's got to fit the legal definition in order to be fit into the Equality Act. So just because someone presents with a mental health issue does not necessarily follow that it's going to be a disability. More often than not, it will be, but it's important to ask ourselves those questions first in order to determine whether or not it is a disability.
Dan, can I just chip in as well?
Of course.
On the last point, I often find that perhaps sometimes the understanding of what is a normal day-to-day activity gets lost as well. And it's the assumption is, oh, can they come to work? Can they do their job? Under the definition, that's not actually the what would be classified as a normal day-to-day activity. For the definition, it would be, can they make a cup of tea? Can they get out of bed? Can they get dressed? Can they function normally day to day by doing those basic tasks as well? So that's something to help you understand. It goes hand in hand with really how substantial is this impairment as well. So the fact that, you know, they can get dressed, they can come into work, they can do their job and whatnot, then that's absolutely fine. But when we're thinking about the severity of this particular condition, we are looking at basic tasks, putting on their socks at the end of the bed, that type of thing, being able to go and pick their child up from school without having some kind of episode, as it were. So just that's, you know, important to bear in mind when we're thinking about normal day-to-day activities under the definition. Sorry to interrupt.
No, great stuff, Jen. Thank you. So once we've established that, you know, there is a disability in play, okay, so we've asked ourselves the questions and we've decided, okay, it looks like this employee, whoever they are, is suffering from a disability. What are the types of claims that they can potentially bring if the company, if it's not dealt with appropriately by the company? Okay, so number one, I've put up on there section 13 claim under the Equality Act, direct discrimination. I'll be quite honest, instances of this are relatively rare. In my experience anyway, as a lawyer, in the time that I've been practicing. And I think the reason because of that is that people and organizations in general are more clued up than they used to be on what constitutes discrimination. More often than not, direct discrimination for the statute definition is basically when someone treats someone, when a person treats another person worse because of the fact that they are, in this instance, disabled, they suffer from a disability. And again, it's very rare that I see it. The only instances that I can think of are where an employee, say for example, an organization has you know, a number of employees and they've got a really good equalities and human and diversity policy, but not everybody is familiar with that. Potentially one employee may say or do something to another employee that is directly discriminatory, okay? So usually you find it in those instances where the person who has said or done the particular thing to the disabled person wasn't aware of what was going on. And then the disabled person can then bring a claim against either that individual who said or did the thing to them, and also the organization itself that they work for. So it's called vicarious liability. So that's the only instances where I've usually seen direct discrimination occur in practice anyway, which I think is a good thing, because obviously it shows that people and organizations are clued up as to what's going on and what constitutes discrimination and how to sort of to guard against that. I must also point out that direct discrimination can never be justified either, okay? And I'll explain what I mean by that as we go through the other claims that could potentially be brought. Indirect discrimination This is when you have a provision, a criterion, or a practice, so a way of doing things, if you like, that applies to everybody in your organization, yeah? But within that entire group of everybody, there's a particular subset of people, i.e. people with disabilities, who are put at a particular disadvantage because of that provision, that criterion or practice, because of that way of doing things, okay? So it applies to everybody. It doesn't appear on the face of it to be discriminatory, but it actually puts the people who have the protected characteristic, in this case, a disability, at a particular disadvantage, okay? And if you have a way of doing things, so it could be a policy, it could be just, you know, the way that you've always done a particular, you know, paper delivery, something like that. If it's been done that way for a while and you have, it's called objective justification. This is where you can justify that policy, provision, criterion, or practice by saying, well, we only have that in place because it's a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. Okay, so it's important to remember that direct discrimination, you can never justify it. So that can never be justified by way of objective justification. Indirect discrimination potentially can be, provided that whatever is put in place is a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. So you've got to have those two ingredients in order to raise that defense to a claim of indirect discrimination. So a couple, I've just seen Corinne asked a question about examples of direct and indirect discrimination. Oh, we've skipped a slide. Let's just go back. Oh no, we've gone back to, sorry about this, guys. Don't know what's happening. Let's get back to, let's see. So yeah, a couple of examples of direct discrimination and indirect discrimination. So an example of a direct discrimination would be, say, for example, you've got two employees. One employee says to the other employee, oh, well, you've been given lots of chances just because you've got depression or something. You know, I get held to a higher standard. It's not fair. Then, you know, that you're treated better in my eyes than I am in light of the company. That would be an example of direct discrimination. Again, it's hard to think of examples of it because I come across it so rarely in practice these days. Indirect discrimination is probably easier to grasp because, again, it's something that applies equally to everybody in the company, but it puts a particular subset of people at a disadvantage. So say, for example, you've got a bonus policy and you can only get the bonus if you you hit a certain amount of targets and you're in a certain amount of time. A person with a mental health problem who maybe has to take off chunks of time due to their illness and they get scored lower because they've not been in attendance or they've not been hitting targets as much as they could be, that would be an example of a potentially indirectly discriminatory policy. So that puts that particular person who's had to take the time off due to their condition at a particular disadvantage because they can't control the fact that they're ill and they've had to be, you know, most of the times you won't get that because the organization itself will discount the fact that that person has been absent because of their disability. Okay, so there, Corinne, I hope that gives you a sort of understanding of what I mean by that. But again, if any of it's unclear, just hit me up after the session and we can have a discussion about that privately.
Thank you.
Okay, so discrimination arising out of disability is essentially when a person, so A, discriminates against another person, B, okay, and A treats B unfavorably because of something arising in consequence of B's disability. So usually that is, say, for example, a person who has, I don't know, they cry quite a lot because they've got an anxiety disorder, let's say, and it's affecting their ability to do their work. So it's not the disability itself that is causing the issue for the employer. The employer is saying, why is this person crying all the time? You know, I just wish they'd get on. They're crying down the phone to customers. I just can't have that. And they potentially discipline the employee. I mean, that's an extreme example, but say, for example, it did happen, or they dismiss the employee and say it's just not working out. That is discrimination arising out of something from that person's disability. If that person's disability causes, you know, the particular behavior, in this instance, the crying, then it's not the disability itself, it's a behavior arising out of it. So that's the distinction between direct, indirect, and discrimination arising out of. Okay.
I've got a really interesting one. Am I allowed to share, Dan?
I think you should. I think this is the sharing forum, so crack on.
So there was an individual that was dismissed. They worked at a supermarket and they were dismissed because they stole and then ate a sausage roll from the deli counter, and they were dismissed. And during the disciplinary hearing, they brought up the fact that they had PTSD. And PTSD was brought on because they had a particularly abusive relationship, and you know, in years gone by. And however, this wasn't taken into account, and she was dismissed, the individual. On appeal, brought it up again, and basically the individual was saying that during the stealing and eating of the sausage roll, she had a particular episode whereby she was suffering from the effects of PTSD, and the only thing to help her was to eat a sausage roll. Now, it does sound a bit far-fetched, and it was found to be quite far-fetched. However, what they had to do with the employer is to obtain an occupational health report, to obtain, first of all, ascertain whether this individual did have PTSD and therefore was a disability, but also as well, was eating sausage rolls in the middle of an episode something that was caused by the disability itself, and was that a reasonable excuse, as it were, a mitigation? It was found not to be the case, that's not, you know, in this individual what happens, in that you don't steal and then eat a sausage roll to cope with that particular PTSD condition. But it was quite interesting, and obviously I know that you're going to be touching on reasonable adjustments and occupational health reports, so that was quite a relevant example.
Just seen a comment from Carolina there. Interesting story, Jenny. Thank you for sharing. Okay, so finally, we're just going to talk briefly about failure to make reasonable adjustments. Obviously, if we've got a disability, we as an employer, we have to be mindful of the fact that there may be certain things that we can put into place, that we can change about our working practices that allow that person to come to work and to fulfill their full potential in work, so they can, you know, operate on the same level playing field as everybody else. That's essentially the duty to make reasonable adjustments, and that adjustment could be the alteration of, you know, as I said about before, a bonus policy. It could be the physical alteration of the office. One case I was reading the other day, there was an employee and he suffered from fairly severe Asperger's syndrome, and his desk was placed on it was in the middle of a thoroughfare of the office, and there were a lot of people coming and going behind him all the time. And he said that just put him on such an edge that he couldn't operate properly, he couldn't function and do his job properly because of the location of his desk. He asked for the desk to be moved. The employer, for reasons beyond me, I don't see what's so hard about moving a desk. It seems like quite an easy adjustment to make, in my opinion. Didn't do it. And then obviously he was able to bring his claim for failure to make a reasonable adjustment. So, and very briefly, victimization and harassment, they're usually claims you see brought in conjunction with others, because usually the facts that give rise to a direct discrimination claim or a discrimination arising out of claim tend to dovetail into victimization and harassment as well. Harassment is just when someone treats a disabled person, in a way that makes them feel humiliated, degraded, or offended, okay? And it cannot be justified either. So similar to direct discrimination. And victimization is a bit different. It's when a disabled person is treated badly because they've tried to make a complaint under the Equality Act. So they've tried to do something about it. Maybe they've raised a grievance and said, you know, hang on, I'm not happy with this treatment. I think it should be changed. And the employer hasn't done anything about it. And even worse, they've actually, you know, harassed the employee in consequence of that. So that's essentially a whistle-stop tour, if you like, of all of the claims that can be brought in an employment context when we're talking about Equality Act claims. So just talking a bit more in depth about reasonable adjustments, it's your duty to make the adjustments for the disabled employees and for applicants as well. So the duty arises before the person has even started at the organisation. So remember my point before about the client I was speaking to who was shocked about the fact that this person had this right. It's a day one right not to be discriminated against, either in employment itself or during the recruitment process, okay? And particularly the reasonable adjustments, in the application process. It may be conducting an interview, by way of telephone, if that's not appropriate, if the person feels particularly affected by the disability and they can't attend a face-to-face interview. Certainly people, we're seeing a lot more now since the lockdown that people are conducting interviews by way of the way that we're doing now, by Zoom or Teams. So there are other ways of sort of approaching the recruitment process that can ensure that you're not disadvantaging people who are disabled. And when that duty arises, you've got to treat the disabled person more favourably than others in an attempt to reduce or remove that individual's disadvantage. So it's called positive discrimination. So again, the example I talked about before, where another employee is saying, well, hang on a minute, I'm still hitting my targets, but I get held to a higher standard than person X over here. The fact that that person has a disability and we've adjusted the policy to reflect that is obviously an example of this type of treatment. So let's see. So again, back to my sort of recurring theme of this workshop is that there's no one size fits all. And so again, it's the same for reasonable adjustments, really. It's going to depend on the particular person, whatever job they do and whatever disability they suffer from and how it affects them, okay? And so it could include, for example, I've put some examples up on the slide there, amending their work schedule, allowing them to come in a little bit later or slightly earlier, changing their roles and responsibilities if that's feasible. If they've got a lot on their plate at the moment, maybe you could temporarily change that responsibility and say, well, okay, well, you don't need to deal with that for now. You can do something else. An example, the one that I mentioned before about the moving of the desk, changing the work environment, adapting a policy, and providing support and assistance, which Jenny mentioned earlier. That's really important and key to the whole thing, really. But again, it's going to vary from person to person. I think there's a slide in a moment where I talk about the importance between temporary and permanent changes. But before I get onto that, I want to just speak a bit about what Jenny mentioned before, occupational health. Now, once we've established that somebody has a disability, 9 times out of 10, your organisation is not going to be medically qualified to assess that disability, to look at that disability and see how it affects that person. So it's important when that is brought to our attention, whether it's a long-standing employee, whether it's someone who's just started, to sort of have the conversation about whether or not we need further medical evidence to assist us in understanding their disability. And this will do 2 things as well. A lot of times, I think the question, I don't know if you agree with this, Jenny, but a question I get asked a lot is, well, how do we know that this person's anxiety, and I'm using inverted commas because that's what people have said to me, how can we be sure that this person's anxiety, this person's depression is legitimate? Yeah. And it's a fair question to ask. And I think the importance of occupational health does 2 things. It allows you to understand the person's condition more, and it also will give you an indication of whether or not the person is exaggerating elements of their condition to I don't know, get off lightly or what have you. And it sounds terrible to say, but it does happen. You will have
it's prevalent in the process, isn't it, where someone brings it up as mitigation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the importance of getting a good occupational health report early on in the process is so important. And yes, there is a cost associated with it, but the way I always sort of approach it with clients, certainly when I'm advising, is I say, well, would you rather pay the money to have this occupational health report compiled and you to have the knowledge in front of you to then make your decision, or would you rather bulldoze on, make the decision, and potentially pay a lot more than that in defending a tribunal action? That's the way I would always approach it. It's always better to be forewarned is forearmed in this instance, and the importance of a good occupational health report is so key to approaching the problem of mental health, and certainly in terms of making adjustments. Certainly when we are helping clients draft the referral letters to occupational health assessors, it's important to the questions that we ran through before about disability, to set them out specifically in the letter, and then allow the medical expert to come back to us and say, okay, well, he fulfills criteria 1, you know, there is a mental or physical impairment and it is substantial or long term or what have you, okay? So that's the importance of an occupational health report. Back to reasonable adjustments. Again, it varies from person to person. Temporary versus permanent changes. The reason why I mention this is because I had a case a while ago where there was an employee and he did have a disability, and the employee made a change for him. So they fulfilled their duty to make a reasonable adjustment. And they didn't really speak to him about it. They just put it in place and said at the beginning of the matter, okay, this is in place for you now. I think it was, you know, you don't have to work nights. I think that's what it was. And they allowed this to continue, okay, for nigh on a year. I think it was slightly more than a year. It might be in 18 months. And they then said that they wanted to take that ability for him to not work nights away from him. And I had to have the conversation with them and say, well, you've allowed that to continue for 18 months. It's going to be harder for you to explain why that change couldn't be made permanent. You know, if you've got a change that you've made and you allow it to continue for that amount of time, the more likely it is that it's going to be viewed as a permanent change. You know, if you don't keep that under review, then it's likely that the employee will be able to argue at the point at which you take that right away that, well, I was under the impression that this was a permanent change to my working conditions, you know, and they've just changed it without any good reason. So it's important to, if you are going to put a change in place, if it is going to be a temporary change, explain that to the employee at the outset and keep it under review as you go on, because the longer it goes on, the harder it's going to be for you as an organization to argue the opposite, okay? And just a few final thoughts on reasonable adjustments. It's about helping the individual get back to 100%. So remember before I talked about a level playing field. It's very important that we are doing that. We're putting everybody on the same sort of level, okay? It's not about making them, you know, treating them as a special case or, you know, giving them preferential treatment to the detriment of others. It's about making sure that everyone is on an even playing field. And it's the employer's obligation, it's your obligation. Sometimes, especially when we're talking about a mental health impairment or a mental health issue, I should say, it may affect that employee, that individual's ability to be able to respond when you ask the question, well, what can we do to assist you? How can we sort of what can we adjust to help you back into work, to get you to carry on to where you were previously? It's your obligation. Obviously, it's important to ask the question, but you've got to be prepared for the fact that they may not have any response for you, and you've got to be the one who puts forward these solutions. It's your duty to do so, okay? And I think that's all I've got to say on reasonable adjustments and legal risks. Again, I'm just conscious of the time. If you do have any questions, raise them at the end and approach me separately. So I'll hand back now to Jenny to talk a bit more about warning signs.
Yeah, we've literally got 3 more slides now, so obviously we were due to run to 1:30, so we're just a bit over, so I'm sorry about that, but thanks so much for participating anyway. Obviously your feedback has been a nice engaging session. So just to recap really on what we've talked about, and I think the key thing really is that what warning signs we should be looking out for is changes, and that's important. So there are obviously more obvious ones, but certainly changes, and some ones that are pulled up there on the screen. I think what's common misconception is that the most effervescent, vibrant person, the person who's got there together is often seen as the person that doesn't have anything wrong, as it were. So make sure that your eyes on everyone as well. So just because that person's vibrant, bubbly, outgoing doesn't mean that they should be overlooked as well. So changes in their mood as well is really, really important. So just some there for you. And recapping again on what we can do as line managers, if you're responsible for a team, or even just for your colleagues, just to look out for them. The first point is so important. You are not an expert in mental health. You are not expected to be. And if you feel that that pressure is getting put on you as a manager from your organisation, then that's time for you to speak up as well and ask for additional support, whether that's training, mental health, first aid training, or additional support for you to offload if you are being told confidential information about an individual's health, somewhere that you need to go, so you don't burden all that as well. But generally, it is a common sense approach, and it's all about being a good people manager and getting to the nub of what your employee likes, dislikes, and whatnot. It should essentially, mental health should be approached in the same way as physical or mental health, in the sense that it's just as important, it's just not as well known. And just because you can't see something doesn't mean it's happening. It's really easy to put a plaster on a cut when you see blood. It's difficult to know what to do when an employee is saying, I need help, I'm struggling, what do I do? And therefore, it's really important that we seek expert advice, in that we are not there to provide a solution to the problem, but we're there to listen, to understand, and signpost to the various services that we might have available. And that brings on nicely to thinking about how we can support it. So primary, secondary, and tertiary support. Essentially, the primary support is you being proactive in your planning of supporting of when it comes to promoting good, positive mental health. Thinking about what you can do to avoid it in the first instance and reduce that risk from a health and safety point of view as well. But the secondary support is where you come in and where you have the most influence. So again, it's all about that communication. It's all about action planning if a problem does arise. And obviously you providing that additional support, or you putting in place additional support. It doesn't necessarily have to be you being the one to do that if you're not best placed to do that. And obviously, as Dan said, thinking about those adjustments that can be made either on the basis of medical advice or because of something that you feel as a manager or the individual feels might help them in that interim period. The tertiary support is obviously that third party support. What is it you can do in your organisation to employ specific specialist support? So thinking about EAPs, and obviously employers have very different thoughts when it comes to the successful nature of EAPs, whether it's a good thing or not. Obviously that's up to you to have a look at. Counselling services, outsourcing, thinking about occupational house, either internally or external. Did I say occupational house? Is that, I think I did, rather than occupational health. And then any long-term adjustments that maybe need to make. Maybe this isn't a short-term thing, maybe this is a long-term thing, maybe the job design isn't right, maybe the role isn't right for that individual, maybe we need to think about, rather than putting a plaster on it, as it were, there's actually changing things for the future to support both the business and the employee. Now you've got all this information, what do you even do with it? How do you even take it away? And how do you actually put it into an action plan, as the Stevenson and Fallon report would actually suggest you to do? So I put together a bit of a not an idiot's guide, but a basic how to develop a wellbeing strategy. Now, this is a really basic tool that can be used for any particular strategy, and I've just filled it in with a couple of information bits. You can essentially see how it works. In the middle, there's the overall goal that you as a manager or the business want to achieve. And in this sense, which is its basic form, we want to improve mental health in the organisation. And then you see in the slightly outer circles, the three main initiatives that we could use to support that goal. So in this example, we want to improve organisational confidence when it comes to mental health. We want to increase awareness across the business in relation to mental health and what that is. And then we want to look to provide support services. The offshoots from there are the initiatives. So specifically, what is it we're going to do? And what we're trying to do is break it down into the nitty gritty as to what is it we're going to do, who is going to do it, and by when. So for example, if you look at the example that I've shared of let's train mental health first aiders, and that's been seen as an initiative by some organisations to do, then we would essentially need an external provider, course provider to do that. We would look for volunteers across the business, or we would identify relevant people. And the timescale is, say, for example, by the end of Q4 to do that. And that's putting it in its most basic form. That way that you can actually go away and track what it is you're doing, what your action plan is achieving. And it's a moving beast as well. So maybe one thing might work and one thing won't, but you can replace the initiatives with different activities to support the overall central goal of improving mental health. That's a way of developing a strategy to do it. So hopefully that will be quite helpful. And when obviously you get the recording of the slide, you'll be able to recap on that and maybe develop your own that might be quite useful for you in the business. That does actually bring us to the end of our workshop today on mental health. Thanks so much for everybody coming on. And if anyone does have any questions at this time, please feel free to speak up or whatnot, or to post them in the chat section. Before you do dash off though, if we don't have any questions and whatnot, Izzy is just going to pop up a quick poll just for you to provide us with some feedback on how you thought today's session went. But once again, from both myself and Dan, thanks so much for coming on. We really, really appreciate your time today. And sorry for running slightly over, but as you can imagine, it's a really big topic for us to cover and it's important. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
So obviously the poll's just now up, so if you wouldn't mind just taking a moment just to provide us with some feedback, and that would be super, thank you. It is anonymous as well, so thanks very much. Okay, that's great. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone, and for those of you that are dashing off to another meeting, hopefully it's not a pressurised one. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are we alone?
Hello.
Is that it? Are we good?
Yeah, it's just us now. Have those results come in?
Yeah, I can see them. Yeah.
Yeah, I can see them. Okay, so that's good.
No pause. That's good.
Who the hell said we were average?
2 people said average. How rude.
That is rude.
I wish I could have voted. I thought it was good. Thought it was excellent.
You should have done.
I don't think in fact, yeah, why didn't we vote?
Yeah, I could have voted for myself. And
in fact, yeah, we should do that. We should say, well, the votes were actually higher because we